This is Urban Lens. One-on-one interviews with breaking artists and the history of art itself.
Basquiat, Picasso, Emory Douglas, Rembrandt, Motley,
Georgia O'Keeffe,
Kadir Nelson,
Luis Bourgeois,
Michelangelo,
Yayoi Kazama,
Donatello,
Agnes Martin,
Da Vinci,
Faith Ringgold,
Van Gogh,
Frida Kahlo,
Gauguin,
Yoko Ono,
Romer Bearden,
Barbara Kruger.
Diego Rivera.
And welcome to Urban Lens Podcast. I'm Steve Gregory. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing someone who I've worked with in the past in a different capacity. I've actually hung his work a couple times, and it's been my pleasure. It's beautiful stuff. It is not painting. It is not oil. It is not canvas. I guess you can print it on canvas. But today I have the pleasure of bringing on Urban Lens a photographer for the first time, Mr. Sam Kidner. Thank you, Sam, for being here.
Hey, great to be with you.
I am, well, it's starting with that, as I mentioned, the art as photography. Actually, before all that, let me talk about what we just saw coming in. Those of you who are listening to the podcast, you didn't get to see that, but those of you watching, thank you for tuning in again right here on listenvision.com. It was a time-lapse photography film of the inauguration from Obama's second, correct?
His second inauguration, right.
His second. Tell me about that experience and what is it like working in a political environment as a photographer?
Wow. Well, it's pretty crazy. I mean, I've been around D.C. for a long time. I came here in the late 80s. I'm an old guy, but still young at heart. But I mean, originally I did a lot of photojournalistic photography. You're in Washington, D.C. Of course, you're going to shoot things that are going on at the Capitol, and there's a lot of work there for photographers for
Absolutely.
different publications, particularly back when I started out. So I was in and out of that world, in my early years in D.C. photographing.
It's got to be a thrill, I mean.
Yeah, definitely. You get, now I'm talking a little hesitantly about it because I definitely got a little burnt out on the scene down there, the full-on egos. Not that you don't run into egos in all kinds of different sectors of work and the business and stuff, but I enjoyed being down there, and you feel like you are witnessing history and photographing history. And I had a couple of opportunities to photograph, particularly the Obama inaugurations, where you really felt
Absolutely.
like you were witnessing history, and it was amazing. Of course, the first Obama inauguration was about the coldest day of my life.
Yeah, I want to go to that picture as well. There it is right here. Kind of an iconic image, Michelle in her yellow jacket, Obama in his first inauguration. I guess I want to ask you in particular about that shot. Tell me about the press pass you had to get to be that close to get a picture like that.
Well, I was part of a group of photographers that was hired by the kind of presidential inaugural committee, and at least in years past, I don't know what they've done in the most recent inauguration, they would hire a group of photographers to document the kind of 3 days of inaugural activities, kind of like a day in the life type thing. Often, they would generally put a book together, giving them to donors or sometimes selling them in the bookstores and stuff. So I was a part of a team, and that was the first Obama inauguration. Came at a time right after I had started doing these stitched together panoramas, which maybe we'll see later.
Oh, you're going to show some of those for sure, yes.
But I really wanted to shoot a panorama of the Obama inauguration. And so it was kind of as the months and weeks built up to the inauguration time, working all my kind of connections and friends in D.C. to see if I could get onto that. And I was pulled in to work for the inaugural committee, and the guys and gals that were in charge, I let them know I'd really like to be in position to shoot the panorama up on the Capitol steps. And it just was kind of a miracle. It all happened in the 11th and a half hour, but they got me a great position, and I shot that panorama. But part of my assignment, besides shooting the panorama I wanted to shoot, was I had to shoot a telephoto shot of him taking the job.
Absolutely.
And that was definitely some pressure, because that oath of office, as a friend photographer of mine pointed out, going into it lasts about 20 seconds or 40 seconds or something like that. So if you don't get it, it's gone. And so, we had multiple cameras set up, and I had like 3 tripods and 4 cameras and all. So I was shooting some of them from a foot pedal,
Right.
and then one holding, to my face, and I was able to get that shot. Of course, it was a beautiful day. It was, as I said, and whenever I look at those pictures from that day, it was so cold. It was unbelievable, and you had to get out there at like 5:30 in the morning to go through security. You can imagine the security
Yes, exactly.
vetting was incredible. You're carrying all this equipment, and kind of snaking through lines with other photographer and media people, but ultimately I got to my position. They very much defined, like you had a number and you had 30 inches and that was your spot
Right.
that you were in all morning. You're out there waiting for noon, which seemed like forever, and then the event starts and you're just you're running on adrenaline and making it happen. And I was out there for a long time, I think till about 5 o'clock, just other things I had to photograph in the aftermath of the inauguration that day. So it was a long one. It was cold, but
Exactly.
it was incredibly exciting for sure.
I remember that day myself. It was very cold. It was freezing. But worth it. And for you to capture that moment is definitely incredible. I want to say again, this is Urban Lens, the Art Podcast. I'm Steve Gregory. Joining me is Sam Kidner, the photographer. And I want to kind of take you off the wall a bit and talk about photography as it relates to art. We will get into photojournalism later and a lot more of your work. But I do want to start off with the beginning. Tell me about when you first fell in love with the camera.
Well, I mean, I learned how to process film when I was about 11 years old. I'm from a small town in North Carolina. I went to this summer camp. It was actually in Pennsylvania where I had some family, and one of the club activities you could do was photography. And this was, of course, back in the film days. And I really loved, that processing, being in the dark.
Did you take the pictures you were processing?
Yes, I had some little Instamatic type camera, and you had to bust open the cartridge and go in the dark and spool it onto the to the film spool and process it. But and then back in my little town in North Carolina, I wasn't really, playing varsity sports at all or anything like that, or even when I was in middle school and stuff. But I was taking pictures, and so we had a couple of small town newspapers, and a couple of the older guys in my neighborhood had shot pictures for these newspapers. So I was like, oh, maybe I can do that. And so throughout my youth, I was taking pictures for a little hometown newspaper and
Wow.
occasionally get them published. And sometimes it was photographing a sports event. Sometimes it was a portrait of someone who won an award or whatever. Or sometimes it was just pictures.
Were you creating your own assignments or were you being assigned?
Well, for the most part, ultimately getting assignments. But I was about to say, I remember like photographing kids running in leaves and flying like they're Superman or something like that. And those were things that I kind of did on my own and imagined like to make it happen and put it together. And they would run a little photo feature with some kind of nice caption.
Do you
or
remember
something.
the first photograph you took that you actually really liked?
I
I can make money doing this. Do you remember that?
Well, I remember vividly a picture that someone else recognized that it was really good, and I've always remembered that going forward. And I think that instilled a lot of confidence in me, like, oh, maybe I should do this
What
more.
was it a picture of?
When I was at this little summer camp, and I shot a picture of he was like the head of the athletics or something, and it was this, not super old guy, but a little bit of an older guy, and he had a tennis racket in his hand and those, buckets of tennis balls and
Right.
stuff. And it was just a really nice portrait. It was just like, hey, can I take a picture of you? And he was like, sure. And maybe, back then snapped 1 or 2 frames. Now I would shoot
Right.
with digital, I would shoot 80 frames on somebody,
Right.
on the most casual picture. But I shot this 1 or 2 picture frames on him, and then when I processed it, the photography instructor just noticed it. It's like particularly with film, and it happens with digital too, is something will leap off of that medium, like that strip of film. There was something about the glow of the quality of light that you actually captured. However, you managed to bring it to the other side by processing it chemically, and that you didn't screw it up. You didn't open the back of the camera and it got ruined or whatever. And you see that, and it's just so beautiful, and it's from this other place. It's from this other time. You've actually I guess it's almost like delivering a baby or something, and you have that, and it just jumps. There might be a bunch of other ones next to it, but it didn't come together as much. The light wasn't right. You just can tell the composition's kind of crappy or it's nothing. But sometimes you just see these, and you'll see it on your computer when you have a bunch of those thumbnails, or back in the film days, and there's something about that frame. It'll just like glow up to you, and it's like, this is amazing. And I remember that was kind of what was going on with that portrait of that fellow and the photography instructor.
You remember his name?
Wally Ehringhaus.
Wally Ehringhaus.
I did a great portrait of Wally Ehringhaus, and that got me to where I am today.
That's pretty amazing. I wanted to ask you, you talked about the amount of time it takes for getting the shot when you talked about Obama raising his hand. I do know from speaking to other photographers, the amount of time they sit in one position. And you talked about the equipment and how the shutter speed, and also just having so many technical things are involved in taking a picture, as well as your patience. And really, you can sit all day for one shot.
Correct.
So I want to just jump into the topic of, is photography art? And obviously, some people say, oh, you're just a photographer, you're taking pictures. I love this one of you taking a picture of an actual mural, posing with the actual mural.
Right.
But that is a question. Is photography art, and why?
Well, first of all, that picture of me like leaning over trying to mimic is because I'm waiting on time, right?
Okay.
Like I needed to be up on that rooftop, and I'm supposed to take a photograph of this giant mural, but the light, we're waiting for the light to be right, and it seems like it would be so simple because it was kind of a beautiful sunny day, but there were shadows coming in from the building next door that were obscuring parts of the mural, and we realized we had to wait and actually shoot it in segments, like shoot the same picture and then wait 45 minutes later and shoot it again without moving the tripod, so that I could kind of layer in and get rid of this nasty shadow that was over here. So it's like, well, we've got some time to kill, and I'm goofing off. And,
Right.
my this is great assistant that I use, Audrey Liu, snapped that picture of me. But I guess back to your question was about the photography and art thing, right?
Yes.
And I mean, of course, photography can be done in an artful way, and it is an art. It's also a craft, and it's also can be very technical, and so it's not always artfully executed, or the results aren't always kind of reaching a higher level of art, but it's definitely an artistic endeavor and process, and there's all kinds of different photography.
So is it more, it seems like you're leaning more towards, it's the intention of what you're producing. Is it to be a piece of art, or is it for a corporation, for their logo or for their image? I mean, what makes it art?
Well, ultimately,
or is it just the craft itself art?
Well, I think it's both, because I think there's two elements. There's the elements of actually when you are there producing the work, which really also breaks into two segments. When you're there kind of on site, or if you're working in a studio or something. I mainly work on location out in the world, out in the so-called real world. Some photographers work in studios creating visuals, but that whole process of making the work is an artistic experience, and you're working in, so you're having this art experience while you're doing it, and you have to approach the problem solving as you go, minute by minute, in an artful way. So that's one part, but then what is it that you do produce? Because you're producing this image, basically, and does that image rise to kind of being a piece of art? And there's certainly, again, nuances and variations. There's commercial art. Does it work as a piece of commercial art that has kind of a purpose that might be more for selling a product or reinforcing an idea, whether it's in kind of editorial idea or an advertising idea or something like that? Or does it work as an end in of itself, as a piece of art that you want to put on the wall and look at? Ultimately, a piece of art is something that gives you gives the viewer an emotional response. So there's my process and experience of creating it, that I might have a bunch of different emotions involved and stuff, but there's also what I'm really trying to be a conduit to the viewer.
Right.
Like I'm producing this piece to kind of evoke, sometimes with intention, certain kinds of emotions, and sometimes like however you want to interpret it, but to get a response, a feeling. I mean, I think art is. I think the ultimate art is music for sure, because it makes you feel so much. But I think that painting and photography and sculpture and all kinds of different artistic endeavors you experience that art, and you do feel an emotional response. And when you sometimes that's again yours is a happy response, sometimes it's something that makes you sad or you're thinking hard or whatever. But it's a whole mishmash of stuff, you know.
Yeah, getting into deeper the art form of photography. You brought something up that kind of was a wild moment to me. You mentioned the conditions of being outside photography, in essence, street photography,
right?
As opposed to being in a studio, like an Annie Leibovitz, who kind of does both, and you do both as well. But talk to me about those different art forms, being in the studio and being out like you were, shooting murals and shooting things of that nature, being out, dealing with the outdoor elements.
Well, of course, you're out there in the real world, and you have chaos. You're always dealing with chaos, and photographers typically want to lessen the amount of chaos they're dealing with and be in control. And those types of photographers will gravitate more towards working in a studio environment where they may be doing portraiture or still life work, where they're creating shapes and things where they can really control what's going on and make that picture. Because I have more of a photojournalistic background and documentary photography background, and that's what drew me into photography in the first place, is being out in the world and capturing
so
images.
You don't mind
out
the elements?
No, not at all. I mean, it's going to get cold soon here with winter, and I know I'm going to be freezing my butt off, and I'm going to be bumming out about that at times. But no, being out there I think that's where it's at for the most part for me in photography, is definitely being out in the world and trying to capture images. And I was like, going back to your art thing, you know, a painter and an artist creating something from a blank canvas. I mean, that's amazing to me. Like my wife, Bobby, she's an incredible artist. She does collage and painting and just comes up with stuff out of nowhere. I'm at least having a starting block, right? Like I'm going out into the real world. Now that can be a plus and a minus, you know, because I'm having to deal with so much chaos of other things out in the world. How do I focus in on what it is I want to capture, either because I need to capture it because it's client work and there's something specific I need to get, whether it's a specific building and it's like, oh shit, you know, there are a bunch of cars parked in front of it, what are we going to do? Or just capture a specific feeling of how people move through the neighborhood and that it's a cool place to be or whatever. But I think that I'm still going out there, whether I'm doing client work or shooting on my own, and I always like to try to say photographing on my own. I don't like to use the term shooting all the time that we do, but it's just part of the lexicon of photography. But nonetheless, is that I'm still usually going out there with something that I want to say or evoke.
I want to ask you about that. Excuse me. Like, let's go to one of his pictures, Jay. As far as, because you're talking about the specific moment, block-wise, city-wise, your picture of DuPont Circle, and really you can show either one, Jay. But it's hitting on exactly what you're talking about. I want to talk about those moments,
right? When
you know you've got it, because there's so much action in these photos that you have.
Oh well,
I want to quickly have everyone go to your Instagram page, which is
it's just at Sam Kittner, you know, SAMKITTNER.
Okay, and look at some of his photographs. But talk about this one again, because it's beautiful. But all the action there. How do you know when you get the moment?
Well, this is a bunch of moments actually. This is 14th and U Street actually. Okay. And this is newer work that I'm doing that some of it is related to assignment work that I'm doing now, but it is more of kind of my personal work at this point. And what this is a stitched together panorama. So you can see it's a very long and narrow scene, and I'm actually shooting segments. You can imagine maybe a 35 millimeter style camera mounted on a tripod. We have some special hardware mounted in vertical orientation, and I can shoot with this special hardware very specific segments, basically moving left to right or right to left. So that might be made up of about 6 segments that I'm rotating around to get. But it's it's insane. Like this image, it's interesting. You say, "Oh, that's such a great moment." Well, what it really is, it's a combination of a lot of really great moments all in the same space.
That's interesting.
So
Jay,
in
here's a couple more, Jay. If you could show a couple more of those too for people watching on Listen Vision. If you are tuning in again, this is Sam Kidner, the photographer. This is a beautiful image of Manhattan.
Yeah, this is Times Square.
Again, same concept?
Same concept of shooting the segments. This one's much simpler because there weren't, even though it was Times Square where there's usually 1 million people, there weren't 1 million people.
How'd you get that moment?
Because
Or
it was
several
raining.
moments?
Because it was raining at night. It was basically just a rainy night,
Okay.
and it was probably like a Tuesday night or something. I think I was in New York for another assignment that had nothing to do with.
So
taking
one
this
instant
picture.
where the weather and the conditions worked in your benefit.
Right, and I'm sure that I remember actually. I almost didn't go out and shoot that picture because we went up there and I was doing some kind of commercial corporate assignments and portraits of for some company or association in New York, and it was like we're going to be there overnight. Have a hotel right near Times Square. I just started doing these panoramas kind of on my own. And I'm thinking, oh, well, while we're in New York, we'll go out and do a Times Square panorama. Maybe the timing will work out. I can do it at dusk when the light's really cool and the sky's glowing and all this stuff. Well, it's kind of raining and it didn't really happen. And I almost didn't go out. And actually, it was another. I often work with an assistant and kind of the same people. And my friend Samuel Olajude was with me then, and he basically was like, no, you got to go out there and do it. And it was because it's not, maybe it won't really be raining. I was like, okay, I remember he's holding like a plastic bag over my camera in my head while I'm shooting that. We're in the middle of Times Square and no one's there because, again, It's not like a weekend. It's kind of a Tuesday night, and had been raining and sprinkling all night, but it wasn't raining too hard when I shot that. And it was kind of it just came together. So there's a lot of serendipitous things that happen in photography. Of you think you want it to be beautiful, but if you actually get your butt out there and shoot it, even if it's not, you might come up with a really unique moment or series of moments, as I'm saying. Because just to explain a little bit more about that U Street thing, in essence what it is whether I'm shooting these segments I just explained or kind of a single view of photography, of a composition with a camera, I'm shooting a bunch of different exposures without moving that camera, right? So I can kind of go back and layer parts of what maybe something that happened 5 minutes ago onto a base layer of something that happened at the start, right? And I could do that a bunch of times. So it's in essence, it's like encapsulated time lapse. I really love time lapse. I'm not a great time lapse photographer, even though you ran a kind
We have
of
another one we're gonna show
time
too.
lapse.
Nice.
I've just done kind of hack-wise, but I really love that. But what I'm able to, because I come from a still photography background, where it is all about that single image, I'm doing this technique, and I'm certainly not the only one in the world doing it at all, but where we're layering together and in essence making these encapsulated time-lapse images. So they're single images, but parts of them are from earlier or later in the amount of time that I was shooting. I might just shoot that same picture, and I'm not necessarily shooting constantly over a 10-minute period, or it might be a 20-minute period, or sometimes longer, but usually about 10 to 20 minutes. And again, then I'm going back and making decisions about what is the action or the people or the light that I want to keep from that I captured over that time period to make a single image.
Right. That's sticking to the art form and right where you are.
Right.
Shutter speed. I want to talk about shutter speed because you do a lot of beautiful shutter speed work. I actually happen to hang one. If Jay has that one up, I hung one of your beautiful pieces that was done with shutter speed.
You mean like blur?
Yes, the blurring.
Right.
Whatever.
Right.
I could be technically incorrect, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, you get it with shutter
Right.
speed, but the end result is the feeling of a motion within a still image.
Exactly.
So again, it's all going back to that.
But I want to ask you, some people will look at that work and say, oh, pure photographers, oh, he's just using some kind of tricks in the camera. Is that really art? And so, again, sticking to the whole photography as an art theme, how do you feel about that? How much editing will actually say, oh, that's not real camera or real picture, that's just done on a computer? How do you feel about that whole discussion?
I I kind of feel like most of it is bullshit, like, I mean, there's some purists out there that have a definition of what a photograph is.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I very much respect and I appreciate photojournalists and photojournalism. And I had a lot of experience and still do work in that world. But maybe from that quarter, you do have still kind of a directive that it's like an instantaneous moment, that you're not manipulating the image, right, and stuff like that. But even that, I think you can sort of make arguments against, like, when does a photographer decide to take the picture? Which image are they going to select, right, to present to the world, where the person's looking sad or the person's looking happy? I mean, give me a break, right? There's still always going to be some level of decision making and thus manipulation as to what is presented in the as a document. So, but I mean, I think it's all to taste. It's all to people's personal taste, and I think it all can. A lot of Photoshop work, in essence, is what people would commonly refer to it, can be good. I think there's a difference, and not that it's a good or evil, bad or good difference, but I mean, when digital photography first happened, people were like, "Oh, you take the picture, boom, it shows up on the back of the camera, you're done. That you don't have to process the film, you don't have to wait." And your image is, you've done the picture, right? But that really wasn't true, because that digital file that camera and the medium captured was in essence like your negative from a piece of film. And just like a negative from a piece of film, when you went into the darkroom to print it, you needed to optimize it to make it present well. Not necessarily manipulate it and change the content of what was in the image, but just to do things like change the contrast and the light dodging and burning to make something lighter or darker, so that it read in a certain way, so that your eye was drawn to the action or something like that. So that happens. And so with I think any of the digital photography imaging, one is compelled to optimize the image. And you can do amazing things now, much more so than you ever could do with film, in terms of capturing a range of light from shadow detail to highlight and stuff like that. You can optimize the color and things. But then there is the next step of, for lack of a better term, kind of altering the image content. Maybe some people would call that manipulation of the image, sure. But I mean, I'm in essence doing that by layering exposures and layering and masking different parts of an image over another. But I don't think it makes it any less valid as a photograph or a piece of art. And definitely kind of this encapsulated time-lapse thing that we just described in those street panoramas and stuff. To me, that's like an amazing way, and it's not totally new, because even back in the film days, photographers masked film and brought different parts of one piece of film over another to make a print. But it's an amazing way to kind of express what goes on in a space of like these intersections, right? So you show in a little bit of a different way, but it's still all captured photographically. You're still capturing every piece of it with light and through a camera, of how that space is utilized over a period of time. But you are making your own decisions, like, okay, I'm going to keep this person here and this person, and I'm going to try to show those relationships. But it doesn't always have to be in one single frame anymore. And I don't think that like process invalidates it from being considered a photographic document that gives you a feeling and emotion of what it's like to be in that space. I think that's just as valid as kind of a single image, maybe of a tighter view of what's going on in that space, that would be considered maybe a different, more older definition of what a photograph should look like. Right?
We're gonna,
does that make sense?
It does. It makes total sense. We're going to shift gears and go to break shortly. Before we do, I wanted to ask you this, sticking again on the same kind of vein. Has apps and filters and Snapchat and Instagram and social media, has it hurt or helped your industry as far as art and photographers?
Well, I
Because
think
everybody's we have millions of photographers now. I mean,
yeah. It's a mixed bag. It's I would say probably overall it's a good thing. There's definitely days you wake up and you go, oh, it really sucks because everyone's a photographer, and it's kind of cheapened photography in a way. I mean, back when I started out, back in the film days, it was an actual skill and craft to be able to technically expose and process film properly. That knocked down a lot of people from being photographers. There are a lot, it was impossible to do that. And it was kind of amazing when you got to the point you could do that and you had a marketable skill. Like, people would hire you to do that for them. With the advent of iPhones and mobile photography and the way cameras have gone, is kind of referred to as a democratization of imaging, right? Like, anybody can take a picture.
Hey,
now.
I'm a good photographer.
And mostly that's a good thing.
Right.
Like, it's great for people to be able to take their own pictures. I'm actually happy about it because I don't have to take everybody's pictures anymore, and the family and stuff like that. Like, they can get that, So that's wonderful, but it has had a negative effect on professional photography in terms of pricing and demand and stuff like that. But I'm actually feeling much more confident about it because I think it was always a small kind of piece of the pie of potential clientele out there that would actually spend money, even back when I started out in the late 80s and 90s and stuff, on photography and pay kind of a professional rate for that service. And it really shrunk as people started, we can have the intern take the picture with the iPhone, or we can get by with that. But that piece of pie actually has kind of come full circle, and I think a lot of those clients now are like, no, we tried that. We really don't want to do it that way, not only because we want the quality of the imagery to represent our company or our publication or our university or whatever in a good light, but we also want someone who is actually providing that service that's not only going to get great images. I mean, that's a given. You've got to deliver really great images,
right,
but that's also going to represent us well when that person is on site. Often I'm even though I'm a freelancer, the people I'm photographing for a company or something, the people I'm interacting with have no idea that I'm not an employee of that company, and I'm photographing like their board of directors or their investors or clients, or I'm photographing in a building that's like a multi-million-dollar building that we need to get in and out of those buildings with no problem, right? Mm-hmm. Like, everyone's happy, we get in and out, we get the images. And, a lot of times they're not even going to remember. I mean, hopefully they're going to remember the pictures most of all, right, but they'll definitely remember if you were kind of a prick on site and cussed someone out or said something wrong to the wrong person. So they, I think it's kind of solidified. And but there's definitely like a million pictures out there every day. It's too much to look through. But somehow still, I think the great work does rise up to the top for the most part. I mean, I would say even back in the film days, there were great photographers that were never going to get published, that were incredible because they weren't out there. They weren't meeting people at the publications or whatever to get published, and they were kind of going to just always be a little obscure, and a couple of people were going to know about them. But it's pretty wild scene, but I do feel that if you talk to me around 2008 or 9 or 10, I would probably be singing a sob story that maybe you would have expected to hear tonight. Right. But actually now I'm much more confident there is a place for professional photography, both as a service and as a commercial endeavor, and as art and just usefulness out there in the world.
Excellent. Thank you. Take a short break. When we get back, more from Urban Lens and photographer Sam Kidner.
Matisse,
Kara Elizabeth Walker,
Jackson Pollock, Gordon Parks.
Urban Lens is a great opportunity for the creatives among us to tell those stories, inspire others, and sell their art.
We're taking the artist off the wall. covering events like Art Basel in Miami, Coachella, London Fashion Week.
Art means expressing yourself. Art means bringing the world closer. Art means creating something that everyone can see beauty in.
Matisse.
Kara. And welcome back to Urban Lens Podcast as we are going over photography with Sam Kidner and his craft. We're showing another time-lapse video of him for those of you who are watching on listenvision.com. But unfortunately, people who are listening on the podcast, you just have to hear me chat. And welcome back. I wanted to get into quickly photojournalism and the social responsibility of artists and photographers. Gordon Parks, one of my personal favorite photographers, says if you don't have anything to say in your photographs, let me get this correct. If you don't have anything to say as a person, your photographs won't have much to say. What do you, Sam Kidner, the person, have to say through your work?
Well, I think I have different things to say at different times, right? Like, I don't think I have one thing I'm trying to get out there into the world. I am kind of going out into the world and reacting to it as a photographer. I think I'm typically going out, though, with some notion of what a point that I want to bring back. But I am open to the serendipity of when I am out there, maybe I'm going to realize something that I didn't go into that assignment thinking, or assignment, or my own self-assignment, thinking that was the point I was going to try to make. Maybe I'm going to discover something new. And that's one of the great things about photography is and being out in the world, kind of in a photojournalistic documentary approach, is that you are both learning and observing as you go. You definitely have to be open-minded. Mm-hmm. But I think that, I'm generally want to celebrate what's around me. That's most of my work now. I have spent time as a photojournalist looking at, kind of serious, kind of bummer social injustices and things that are out there that I really wish weren't out there. And especially earlier in my career, I spent a lot of time, and that was really the focus of my work, was documenting
if you could pull one of those images up. This one, talk to me about this one in particular. The ladies are saying, I am tired of smelling my air. Talk about that. And this is also on your website, which is your website.
It's just Kittner.com, Kittner.com. And when you get to Kittner.com, there's kind of a portfolio site that highlights really more my current work, but there's also kind of an archive. There's a button to hit for archive series, and this environmental documentary work is something that I did right at the beginning of my career in
New Orleans, correct?
That's in Louisiana. And it was in the late 80s and early 90s. I had, without going into the whole story, got involved in photographing the whole kind of beginnings of the environmental justice movement, where people who lived near petrochemical plants and Superfund sites and the like were actually coming out and protesting that. And there were many poor, often African American communities. Of course, even in West Virginia, they were white communities, but they were generally always poor communities where these facilities were sited. And back in the late 80s was kind of the beginning of some of the larger national and international environmental groups like Greenpeace getting involved with the local communities to kind of point this out and fight this. And so I was able to photograph that was from the first Louisiana Toxics March. It was a protest march from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, where there's an incredible concentration of petrochemical plants and Superfund sites, where, again, it was like one of the first times the local community came out and joined forces with the national environmental groups to protest this stuff, bring attention to it. And it was just kind of a big time in the environmental movement. So I followed that story. Different activists and environmentalists and people would tell me of different towns that had big problems. And of course, as a photographer, I was looking for places that were really visual, because often that pollution is invisible or is buried under the ground, and it's hard to get that kind of powerful single image.
Right.
You can do big, long photo essay type work, and I did a little bit of that, but I kind of came from like earlier in magazine photography, you know, the famous Life magazine photo essay, a series of pictures.
Right.
I mean, that was something you'd always aspire to. But by the time I came around in the late 80s and 90s, Life magazine, you know, they were publishing, but it was nothing like it used to be. And I remember going to New York and talking to a photo editor there, a person named Lee Dudley, and she told me, like, what we're looking for is everything all in one frame. Like, you've got to show it all. It can be in layer, like a foreground, background, whatever. But we're probably just going to run one picture, and everything needs to be in that picture. So that really directed my quest early in my career of how I was looking at photography, was how can I, what do you call it, juxtapose all these things together, where I could show the houses and the smokestacks, right? Or, you know, the poison rotting barrels, and unfortunately some kid walking by. Like, if you just shot the picture of the barrels, well, maybe it's okay, but you've got to get it all in one shot. So that was a quest I was on for about 4 or 5 years. It's still definitely, it's a really important part of my life and my career that I'm still tuned into, although I'm not actively shooting that work, and I definitely had to kind of move on to concentrate on making a living.
Absolutely. And I want to ask you about that. As far as right now, Puerto Rico, everyone in Puerto Rico does not have power, still to this day.
Right.
And what I feel like is missing is a lot of images from there. And like you talked about, print is kind of a dying thing, right? Everything's digital, everything's online. Do you think it is affecting, I mean, obviously for someone like, I'm jumping around here, but for someone like Russia to affect our election through digital media, through images, through starting Twitter accounts that are false representation, how much is it being watered down, losing that whole print aspect of real photojournalism, and someone being in Puerto Rico now shooting pictures as opposed to these quick bites online? And, you know, that seems to me kind of what's being lost in our news. And fake news is, you create fake news by not having images of the real news.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense, and I think it's one of the downsides of kind of, I mentioned earlier, the democratization of imaging, where anyone can make images, the democratization of media, basically everyone's their own news source and stuff like that. There's some pluses to that. It's great. More voices can be heard that weren't being heard in the kind of mainstream media. But back in the old days, which was just a couple of decades ago or less, is that you did have certain, and I'm just using the term mainstream media outlets, that you looked at to tell you what the state of the world was. And you looked, whether it was the Life magazine or the Washington Post and New York Times, or the TV news, you know, kind of took over from the magazines and stuff. Those were kind of media institutions that you, for the most part, trusted and looked to tell you what was going on, and that would spur some sort of communal action, societal action. Now there's so many voices out there, and those media players are still around, and they're still very important, and I'm glad that kind of in more recent years, the New York Times and the Washington Post have kind of solidified their, you know, financial being and their ability to go out and report the news. And but it is kind of a downside of the digital revolution and the internet revolution and social media stuff, that no one gets all the, again, it's a trade-off. It can be scary to get all your news from the same sources like we used to. I think for the most part, we had really great media in this country. You could be in another country where you're only getting your news from one source and you're being spoon-fed all this stuff, and you'll never know anything different. So there's a greatness about everyone being able to have their voices out there, but there is a downside to it. And everything's watered down now, and you don't know really what's going on. And I'm sure there are photojournalists in Puerto Rico that are making images and reporting that stuff, but they're not getting out in the, it's just, where do you look for it?
Right. Again, this is Urban Lens, our podcast. I'm Steve Gregory. Joining me is Sam Kidner, acclaimed photographer, someone whose work I really respect. I want to ask you, how does the phrase go? You can say anything, but a picture says what? 1,000 words? Is that how it used to go?
Well, that's how classic phrase.
A picture
sure.
says 1,000 words. What do you think? What can you personally do to, and maybe you are already, to make sure that at least the fake news is staying honest when it comes to photojournalism? Like, is that, because all the editing and there's apps now that you can change your look, you can make yourself darker, lighter, longer hair. Adjust your weight.
Yeah.
How do you maintain the integrity of photography? How do you feel like you're responsible for that?
Well, I think there are people out there that are hardcore photojournalists that would think I'm the evil, that I'm not doing that. But I think, because I am putting, bringing parts of images into other images is certainly a part of my work. But I think that you have to do it I think when you present something as a photojournalistic picture, like in newspapers where you expect those pictures, if it is not kind of conform to that idea that this is kind of unmanipulated image, that you just have to, the viewers are pretty savvy now. People are used to seeing all this kind of imaging work now. The appropriate thing to do in that context is to say, and I do this when my multi-exposure work is presented in a publication, say, this is a multi-exposure image, or a pieced together image. Usually we just say multi-exposure, and people get it. But it doesn't, again, going back to what I said earlier, I don't think that makes it less of a document or statement or description or anything. But I think the fact is that nothing's pure. You want things to be reported correctly, but in terms, there and you want your images to have a feeling of authenticity for sure, but it's just there's so many different levels there.
Absolutely. I want to talk about the business aspect, and Jay, you can show as many images of Sam's as you like in this last segment. I want to talk about the business end, because part of what I pride myself on as far as Urban Lens is helping people who are not only professional photographers, people who are aspiring to be you. You mentioned making money. You mentioned sticking to, you have a lot of images where you were paid to do that, commissioned to do these pieces. What would be your advice to someone who's not just using the apps for social media, but who actually is an aspiring photographer? How do you go about making money and establish yourself as a professional photographer?
Become a lawyer. No, I'm just kidding. Or a real estate broker. I do want to answer that, and I will, but I want to come back to just say a thought that I had lost in terms of the manipulation. And what is a photograph in the first place? A lot of people assume that it is the actual thing that you're taking a picture of, right? But I remember this had a big impact on me reading a quote from the great portrait photographer Richard Avedon that said, a portrait is a likeness of that person. It is not that person, right? So a picture of a scene that's going on, it is a likeness, it is a representation of it, but it's not exactly the thing, and it's always going to be kind of an interpretation of the author of whether it's a writer or a photographer or whatever that's there, and then also how it's presented further embellishes that presentation. So photography was never the actual thing, right? It's just, this is a kind of interpretation of what was going on. So I just want to make that point. In terms of making a living as a photographer, it's kind of like good luck. I'm glad I'm not starting over again. For sure. It was a difficult environment when I came into it. Certainly family and friends thought I was a little crazy for pursuing it, and weren't too sure how it was going to work out. So it's just
I was going to ask you about that dynamic because I like hearing young artists talk about their young years as far as dealing with the family dynamic, and you want to create, but they want you to study, and they want you to become a doctor, but you want to create. But you said you started at 11, so I was thinking maybe that didn't play so much a part of as your upbringing, but did it have a part in your upbringing?
No, I had very supportive parents and brothers and sisters and stuff that were cheering me on throughout. I think that my parents probably at times thought, well, maybe you want to make sure you have kind of a backup or get involved in something else, but I never really had a big pushback. But I think that, yeah, it's just it kind of worked out. But I mean, I had times in my own life where I thought, God, am I doing the right thing?
Right.
Maybe I should go to law school.
Right.
But it's just like, one of my uncles, when I was even considering that, said, if you go to law school, you better really love law.
That's true.
So if you're going to do photography, you better really love it. And fortunately, I've always loved it. I've had some times, I've been around a long time. I've been working over 30 plus years, 34 years or something in the field related, and there have been times where I fell a little bit out of love with it. I wasn't so sure. It wasn't just things weren't hitting on all cylinders, both from what I was producing, and again, you get the reinforcement of the client work, and if that work's not coming in, you're wondering, of course, you got to pay your bills, but it's managed. Actually, digital photography really reinvigorated my photography. Okay. It just opened up so many doors to doing things differently that I wasn't shooting pictures in the same way that I was doing throughout, say, the mid-'90s and into the early 2000s. It was getting a little stale.
Jay, if you could show, I want to hear your input or the kind of the creative backdrop on one of my favorite pictures of yours. Is it in the orchestra? I believe you're at a symphony of some sort.
Oh, right.
Yes, this is one of my favorite images of yours. And again, all this is on Sam's website, kidner.com, in case you're listening on the podcast. But I just wanted to show this and get the creative background on this one. Talk to me about this.
Well, this again was, I had already started shooting these panoramas, right? These kind of stitched together images. And for the most part, those would be cityscape images and landscape images. But to do it... to shoot this kind of picture with people in them is really crazy. It makes it super complicated.
Where is this?
Hard. This is the Strathmore Music Center. So I had an assignment from a magazine. It was actually Bethesda Magazine, a very great art director, Mayor McCardle, that's worked with, had given me assignments over the years, knew that I was doing this kind of panoramic imaging. And she had kind of a big 2-page spread, and they wanted to write something about Strathmore, and they wanted it with the Baltimore Symphony.
That's the Baltimore Symphony. Okay.
But when I went to shoot the picture, this was actually a big revelation. Is when I got there, I realized well, first of all, the lights are going to be down most of the time, so I'm not going to be able to get much. And so I really need to get the picture. I might have realized this kind of going into the assignment. I really need to get the pictures like right before the performance when the house lights are up, or at the end of the performance when they bring up the house lights, because I knew it was a beautiful venue with lots of wood and it would have really richness to it. And then when I was there setting up, I was definitely like, wow. The moment, kind of going back to my photojournalistic instincts, is not when people are just kind of sitting there in their seats, like snoozing, listening to the music. Not that they're just kind of in them.
Oh, they're snoozing,
or just they're in them themselves or whatever. But if I'm lucky enough that they actually stand up and applaud, and there's a standing ovation, now that would be a great picture. And so I realized that when I was setting, I wasn't like I was going to be able to move. Like I had to get in there before the performance started. I had to, with the kind of blessing of the people at the venue, established where I was going to be, because I'm not hand holding the camera. I'm on a tripod, and that tripod can't move again, and I can't move during the performance or whatnot. So settling on the place to view from is very important, and I took a lot of confidence. Again, I take confidence from people who say things to me, from a photographer that I really respect, a man named Steve Uzel, who's given me a lot of advice over the years, and I was showing him some of my early panoramas, and he said to me, I think you're going to do pretty good with this because you know where to stand. And so when he said that, it really struck with me. So I always think about very, very hard, where am I going to be? Where am I standing? And usually I really have to commit to that space, because often I cannot move once I've started shooting that.
I appreciate you standing right here.
Right. Well, I'm
Sam
glad to be
Kidner,
here.
right here on Urban Lens Podcast. Thank you very much. We'll see you all next Sunday. It's been a blast, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.
Right.
Art means story, life story, and bringing people together. It's a connector. It's your pain. It's your agony. It's what your perspective in the world is.
Art can be beautiful and art can be ugly.
Beautifully ugly.
This is Urban Lens. Urban Lens.